All right. If I were to ask you what is your favorite story, you'd probably have a lot of stories come rushing to mind. Stories from all sorts of different mediums, from books and movies, maybe stories in a song, uh, children's books, stories that we read as kids or that you're reading to your children. Um, my favorite stories are some of the stories that get passed down person to person, like stories that you pass down through your family. And as I was thinking about what some of my favorite stories are, I thought of the story my grandparents always used to tell me. They used to tell me all the time the story about the day I was born. And I can see my little tiny Dee Dee, and she would say, I remember the day you were born. We got the phone call that you were here, and we were so excited. And then my grandpa's big laugh in the background as they would share that story. And then I was thinking of another favorite story of mine, and that's the one about the time when my brother and I lit our arms on fire. that was a good story. So how it happened was my brother, Ryan, is a little bit of a pyro. Like, not dangerously bad, but as a child, he loved fire. And so we were probably like 12 and 14 by this point, and he found a can of Endust under the kitchen sink, and it read flammable. So of course he says, hey, let's go see if we can light our arms on fire. And as a good little sister, I said, yeah. So we go out there, and you'd spray your arm with the Endust. That was like pledge. And if it was your arm we were lighting on fire, you got to hold the can, and the other one would hold a lighter right in the middle. And when they would flick the flame, you would spray the Endust, and your arm would light on fire for a couple of seconds. And it was exciting. My mom's version is she likes to tell how she was in the kitchen, and she had to shout out the kitchen window, Ryan and Sarah, stop lighting your arms on fire. But nobody got hurt. We only did it the one time because we learned our lesson. We didn't get burned, but it turns out when you light your arms on fire, it makes your mom pretty mad. So we just did it that one time. But it's always made for a really good story. And humans love stories. We have been passing information on to one another through stories since the beginning of time. Because in a story, you can relate to it. You can see yourself in a story. And you can watch how a certain character behaves and think, oh, I want to behave like that. Or watch what they're doing and learn what it is, what the consequences are when you make a particularly bad decision. And stories are also really easy to remember. So we can learn all of these great lessons from a story, and they're highly effective for us in our learning. So we learn these lessons, and then we are able to then pass these stories on to those around us, to our kids, to our friends, and share information this way. And you know who knew humans really loved stories, and who knew that stories were a highly effective way to teach us? It was God. God knew we love stories. It's estimated that 30 to 40% of the Bible is written in stories, as a narrative story, because God knew how effective stories are at teaching us. And it's like he designed the whole thing. So today, we are going to look at one story, and we're going to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're going to look at one of the most popular stories of the Bible, David and Goliath. But today we're going to look at it maybe with our grown-up eyes instead of perhaps the eyes we saw it through in Sunday school. I'm going to start right here in verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul, the men of Israel, were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line in battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley in the middle. So you can see this. You just envision this happening. If this were a movie, you would see this one great army up here on this side of the mountain and the other great army over here on this side of the mountain with this valley in the middle. And the cinematographer coming down and through that valley and showing you all the scenery. And you can imagine, all of the campfires going out first thing in the morning and the smoke is rising and you can just smell it, the war, the men, the battles. And it helps you to envision what's happening here when we understand that the Philistines and the Israelites are mortal enemies. They have been fighting each other for years, generations even. Abraham mentions the Philistines. So this isn't a new enemy by any means. But it is so important that the Israelites hold their line in this particular battle, because should the Israelites lose, the Philistines would then gain access to the hill country of Judah. And the hill country of Judah is two things. It is rich with great resources. So should the Israelites lose, the Philistines are going to gain so much in resources that would be great for their people. Secondly, this is a piece of the promised land. So you understand why these battle lines are so important to the Israelites. And as it happened at battle at that time, is the armies would rise in the morning and prepare and wear whatever, military garb they wore at that time, and they come to each other and they approach the battle line. And from this battle line, they let out their war cry. So they approach and then they come up to this battle line, and it makes me think of, it's that Mel Gibson movie, Braveheart. And he has half a blue face and half a something else face, and they come up to this battle line and they are just screaming. They're shouting at one another in a show of strength and courage, and to intimidate their enemies and really stake their claim. This is their battle cry. And this is what is starting here, how it's happening. Only this time it's unique, because the Philistines, instead of this battle cry, all they have to do is send out their champion. And their champion is nothing short of terrifying. Right here in verse 4. And there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So 6 cubits and a span means Goliath was 9 feet, 9 inches tall. So for a reference, I'm 5'2". LeBron James is 6'9", and Goliath is 9'9". So he's huge. And he had on a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. The weight of the coat of mail was 126 pounds. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. The spearhead alone weighed 15 pounds. So this man, their champion, is huge. He's really big, and he's really strong. And he is being presented to the army of the Israelites with every earthly power and strength that one would think that you would need to be victorious. Goliath has it all. And then we hear him talk here in verse 8. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, Then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. It's not uncommon for our God to present us with insurmountable odds. It's not uncommon for our God to put an obstacle in front of us that we can't conquer, that we can't see our way through or over. And this is what Goliath was to the Israelite army. He came up to them huge, clad in the best armor of the day, and nobody had any idea how to beat him. And Saul's response to him, Saul's response to this testing of the Lord is to just be afraid. He just freezes in fear. And he does nothing. For 40 days. For 40 days, Saul allowed Goliath to walk up to that battle line and shout him down and embarrass Israel and embarrass King Saul and defy the living God. And Saul was frozen in fear. That was his response to such a great big test. And then David comes on the scene. And what I like to notice about this story is what we know about David now versus what they did not know about David then. When we think of David and Goliath, we think of David. This is David of the Bible. This is King David. He was this great king of Israel. He was a warrior. He was a man after God's own heart. Now we know this. But the other characters in this story at the time, they don't know this. They know that he is the youngest son of Jesse. He's the 8th son. And they know that basically that he's Eliab's little brother, the shepherd. We also know from the previous chapter, chapter 16, by this time in David's life, he had just been privately anointed to become king by God through Samuel. So we know that David has already received that promise from God. We also know that God is using David's musical abilities at this time to play music for King Saul when he is tormented at night by evil spirits. So he'd met Saul, however, it doesn't appear that Saul really knew who he was or knew his father or where he came from. And that's touched on just a bit. The very last verses in the book, verse 55 on, it kind of is a little bit of a throwback where King Saul is asking, who is that boy and who is his father? So we know that he was able to work in the palace using his musical abilities, but yet King Saul didn't actually know who he was. And it's quite understandable that the king of Israel didn't know the names and fathers of every servant that came in and out and waited on him at that time. So here comes David on the scene. And David's father, Jesse, tells him, gives him some food and says, I want you to take this food to your brothers, because there were 3 older brothers on the battle lines. And this had been 40 days. So he says, take this food and bring me back a token so that we all know that your brothers are okay. So this is what David did. And we'll pick up here in verse 19. Oh, excuse me. 20. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. as he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard them. And I love that part, because this is David, and he walks up to this battle line, and here's this giant defying the name of the Lord. Imagine if you walked into somewhere and you see someone standing up there and everybody's paying attention to him and they're trash talking the most important relationship in your life, and they've been doing it for 40 days. I mean, you would be bothered. And this was David, and David heard him. And we see here all the men of Israel, when they saw the men and fled from him and were very much afraid. And then the men of Israel, they're sitting around and they're talking about all that has been promised to the person that defeats Goliath. So they're chatting amongst themselves, and whoever can kill Goliath is going to get wealth and riches, the king's daughter, and that their family would be free, meaning they wouldn't have to pay any taxes. So David goes on and says to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." And we see here in the next few verses what David was up to. And David, he's going to little groups of men and groups to men saying, "Are you kidding me? Who's going to do this? This is unacceptable. What does the guy get if they take him down? And who's going to do it? Because how dare he defy the name of our God?" And he's doing this so much that his older brother Eliab even comes up to him and shushes him. "What are you doing? You are a boy. You need to hush your mouth and go back to the sheep." That's exactly what he says. And David says to him, "Well, what have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away from him toward another one and spoke the same thing. David was not bothered by his older brother. He was more concerned with his God. And when the word got around to Saul that there was someone in the camp speaking boldly like this, there was someone who was interested in this challenge, he called David to him. Verse 31, and when the words that David spoke were heard, they were repeated before Saul, and he sent for them. Verse 32, and David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine and to fight with him, for you are but a youth. And he has been a man of war from his youth." We know that David was under 20 years old, because you had to be at least 20 years old to fight in the Israeli army. And Goliath here, he'd been fighting his entire life. But yet, David responds with such confidence. And why? Let's read together and find out. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and I struck him and I delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by the beard and I struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." David knew that his God would defeat any enemy in order that he may keep his promises to his people. David knew this. David knew that God could and would defeat any enemy, no matter how big and how scary and how well armed this enemy may be. David knew that God would and could defeat him because of all of the times that God had already delivered David. So think back through your own life. How many times have you been confronted with something and you thought, I don't know how to handle this. This is too big for me. I think this might take you down. And God delivered you and delivered you and delivered you. Because that is God, and that is the God that David knew. So he was confident enough in his faith to step out in courage and say, yes, I will battle this enemy who has never been defeated because I know my God. And then we go on here to see the difference between the heart of King Saul and the future King David. Because even Saul tries to put David in his royal armor, in his own personal armor, because Saul's heart says, well, you have to go match that worldly battle with the same worldly strengths that are coming at us. He has armor, so you're going to have armor. And David said, I can't move in this. And David took off all the armor because David knew he did not have to be clothed in the worldly strengths and the worldly weapons. He was already clothed in the power of the living God. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch, his sling in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. This is it. This is it. It is on now. You can just imagine these 2 mortal enemies. They have been battling for years. Now here they've been at a stalemate for 40 days. 40 days with their champion coming out and just bashing the Israelites, defying their God with the worst possible things that he could say. And now, finally, there is to be a battle. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And here we have our enemy is unable to be defeated. All strength, big, scary, strong, confident. And we have our unlikely person that God has asked to be obedient and courageous. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you would come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his God. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. And then David said to the Philistines, You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, of the God of the army of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. I will give your dead body to the hosts of the Philistines this day, to the birds of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth. All the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and a spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Boom. It's a mic drop for David. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. David ran quickly to the battle line to meet him because David had confidence in his courage because he knew who his God was. He had confidence in his courage because of all of the times God had delivered him before. Because God keeps his promises, and David knew that our God will defeat anybody, anything, anytime, in order that he may keep his promises to his people. God won't fail me. God won't fail you. God won't fail the church. Because no matter how big, how strong, scary our enemy is never a match for the power of God. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it, and it struck the Philistine in the forehead. And the stone sank into his head, and he fell on his face to the ground. That stone hit Goliath's forehead, going 100 to 150 miles per hour. And it hit his head so hard that it crushed the front part of his skull. So David prevailed. Right, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran over in the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out in the sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. I mean, you bet they did. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines. We'll skip down to 58. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine to Jerusalem, but he put the armor in his tent. So David prevailed. And I have a Goliath that shouts me down every morning. Every morning I wake up, I have a Goliath that draws up to the battle line and shuts me down. You are not smart enough. You are unworthy. You are unloved. You are too lazy. You are too busy. You can't do that. You're a girl. You can't do that. You have the wrong education. You can't do that because you've never been good at it. Every morning. And worse than that, this Goliath will defy my God with lies like, he's not real. He doesn't really know you. How could he know you with all these people in the world? If he was real, why are you hurting? If he was real, why did your friend just die of cancer at 42? And you have Goliath too. Every morning. Because just as the Philistine and the Israelites were at war, we are at war. There is a heaven, there is a hell, and they are at war. And we get to be the army of the living God. So when that Goliath in your life steps up to the battle line and shouts you down, you know what I get to say to that? And what you get to say to that is, show me my stones, God. Where are my stones? Show me my stones, that I may be obedient, and that your power may shine through me and my obedience, so that all of the assembly, that everyone here, everyone watching, my husband, my children, friends, everyone watching will know that you are God through your work through me, because I was obedient and you defeated that enemy that nobody knew how to defeat. Where are my stones, God? Show me my stones. So, We have choices. When the enemy attacks, when the great big scary Goliath draws up, you get to make your choice. You get to choose if you're going to sulk like Saul, if you're going to be afraid, if you're going to freeze and say, there's just no way. I just won't do that. And you just don't act. You could sulk like Saul. Or girls, you could slay like David. You can say, where are my stones, God? Show me my stones. Because David never did this for his own glory. David didn't step up to that battle line so that people would know he was awesome. David stepped up to that battle line so that the world would know the power of God. And God could have absolutely taken Goliath down on his own. Right? Absolutely. We know this about our God. He is all powerful. But he didn't. He didn't have him go out there and roll an ankle and hit a head on a rock. You know, why? Because God wants you. God wants your participation. He wants a relationship, and every relationship requires participation. So he wants you to say, where are my stones? Show me my stones. So that you can choose to be obedient. So you can have confidence in your courage, and you can watch God move and defeat the enemies that are unable to be defeated. And everyone around you will know the power of God. So the next time that Goliath steps up to that battle line and starts to shout you down in your life, you get to go to God. Say, show me my stones, God. Because I know that I can, but you can. Because I know what David knew. I know that I can trust my future to God because he and I have a history. I know that our God is able to defeat that which is unable to be defeated. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.